promised or threatened Oscar that I would introduce him in a multimedia fashion. Patrick, we don't seem to have multimedia. Obviously, a caption isn't required. I met Oscar the first day and the first class that I ever taught. The first time I walked into a classroom, which was a long time ago, the first course I taught, which was research methods, one of the students, looking a bit like a refugee from the Mod Squad, was Oscar. Oscar was, at that time, a master's student at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he worked in a number of areas, including television production. And in fact, his master's thesis, which I advised, I was the advisor on his master's thesis, along with Percy Tannenbaum, was a study of the way in which camera movement or subject movement would convey power of the speaker, the difference between the speaker moving towards the camera or the camera moving towards the speaker. It was an experimental study, possibly the last experimental study that Oscar conducted, but it was a neat, elegant, and effective piece of research. But it also got Oscar engaged with television productions, and he became involved both at Annenberg and at the, I think, CBS in production. And when he left Annenberg, went to UC San Diego, where he taught television production for a while in what was then a new and an exciting communications program begun there by Herb Schiller and others. And from there, actually just moving this along as Oscar becomes more studious, notice the cigarette in his hands.
Purportedly.
Cigarette-looking object. Oscar then moved to Stanford, where he completed his PhD in communication, and from there to Howard, where he taught for quite a while and developed programs in communication research, and from thence back to Annenberg, University of Pennsylvania in a while ago, where it was really a pleasure to have Oscar as a colleague for many years. And just briefly to talk about some of his work, Oscar, I think, has been, certainly for me, very notable in making really interesting, innovative, and original contributions in areas that have not yet become that familiar or well-trodden. His dissertation turned into a book called Beyond Agenda Setting.
That's a book, but it was only partially from that, yes.
Partially. In which, to me at least, was a way of thinking about the relationship between government and other institutions and the press that was really important and insightful and remains. It's one that actually many of you who have been in class with me have heard about, a really useful and valuable way to think about it. And Oscar's work generally at the time, and I think the larger extent since, is focused on the sort of political economy, institutional aspects, but with a very clear awareness of the implications for the lives of citizens and their relationship to the media and the government. He was one of the first people to pay close and skeptical attention to the innovations in electronic technology, communication technology that we now are all too familiar with, but he raised questions about the implications for privacy and personal information, and actually we had long, frequent arguments or questions about my skepticism long since overcome by the persuasiveness not only of Oscar's arguments, but the reality that he was foreseeing before it became all too apparent of the dangers and implications of the data gathering and manipulating power of these technologies. He's also worked in the area of race, a book on race and the communication framework that I found useful both for myself and for teaching and research, and has sort of worked on that intersection of, as I said, the relationship between technology, society, and the experience of citizens in a way that continues to be provocative and important. And I'll stop using it at this time and turn it over to Oscar.
Thank you. Let me say what a really special experience it is to be introduced to soon-to-be friends by a friend and a mentor. So thank you for the introduction. You know, despite having to look at some of those images again, but there are always costs that go along with that. Larry has, as you can see from that presentation, this incredible style, this incredible ability, and only his generosity kept him from going on, you know, for an hour or so. Because of the skill that he has. I'm quite different, and in fact, perhaps one of the reasons why I've left the classroom for the benefit of my office in Tucson is that I find lecturing difficult. I have to write down every word. I write down the jokes. I have to follow them there in order to maybe nod and hint that there's a joke coming. You want to pay attention to that. And here's a kind of a line. And the suggestion, especially at an event like this, where I'm supposed to say, now this is important, remember to take a note here, or I'm going to give you a reference where you're going to find this. But before I give you an example then of the things that I have written down in advance, and there may be a joke or two in there, I wanted to thank Peter for making this possible, bringing me here. And I should sort of confess, it's not entirely true that I wouldn't have anything to say if it were not for Peter's invitation, but it's always good to have, you know, a date certain when you're supposed to have something that you're supposed to present. Otherwise, you just might go on looking at birds and watching cactus and other kinds of things that one does out there in Tucson. What I want to talk with you about today is this long-term project that I'm working on with a student, and I would now say colleague of mine. It's kind of a long-term conversation that we've been having, and I believe it's going to turn into something or into several somethings that I think might be of value. Ken Farrell is a doctoral student at Annenberg. And I don't know, you say that no good deed goes unpunished, so let me tell you about something that we do with the other Annenberg that you can ask for that to be done here. Part of what Ken and I did as a seminar, and you might understand this as turning a traditional seminar or a reading course on its head. What Ken did was to give me 100 pages a week that I would read, and then we would go together and talk about those pages. As you might imagine, the page limits and the time limits never worked out that way, but I think that both of us learned a great deal by that deal, where the students suggest to the professor, well, these are the things that I'm struggling with, read these and talk with me about them. One of the things that we worked on, which might not have been as wonderful as Ken wanted, was actor network theory. You find out, there's some things I'm sort of resistant to accepting, having to do with the location of agency in that regard. But nevertheless, I think both of us grew as a result of that. This project then kind of reflects this continuing conversation that Ken and I are having. But again, we will have these rough spots that you may or may not detect in the presentation, having to do with what Ken's interested in and what I'm interested in. Ken is an advocate of cyberspace. He wants us to understand what cyberspace is, and therefore to appreciate it and perhaps to defend it, to enable it to be the things that it might be. I'm much more interested in understanding how cyberspace comes to be. What's the nature of the actions, that shape, that constrain, that enable what cyberspace is. So these papers that we're developing are something of a compromise in that regard. I learned a lot from the work that, that we did. These discussions I was suggesting provided the background for the work that I want to do. I think Ken and I agreed that we want to understand how it is that actors influence socio-technical developments, how they influence them across different spheres of activity. My commitment has been suggested to political economy suggests that we ought to look at these in terms of three spheres or venues of activity. We differentiate between those spheres. You might recognize them by other kinds of labels, but I won't use those labels anymore. And we'll talk about the technology as one sphere and what are the nature of the forces, engineers that are involved in developing technology. Another sphere, we'll talk about the market and the way in which energy resources are used in order to producing, reproducing, selling, distributing those technologies. This third sphere is the sphere where we talk about culture and social practice and also law and institutions that shape the ways in which you want to use technologies and introduce them into markets or not. So Ken and I have decided to focus on this third sphere, and within this third sphere to focus on the role of the courts. All right, so there are lots of actors that are involved in shaping what we might characterize as formal legal limitations on the things that one might do in creating and using technology. We've decided to focus on the courts and the role that the courts play then in enabling and limiting the uses of technology. Now, my commitment to communication from the analysis of frames, you left that one out, Larry, no, is something that is also part of the work that we're doing here. This is this notion that says the way in which you tell stories, the way in which you talk about dangers and risk and threats shape your understanding. And so there are also, therefore, frames in legal discourse. And so part of what this work wants to do is to understand the nature of the frames in legal discourse. And so part of our discovery and my learning from Ken is that there are certain kinds of, if you'll allow, kind of framing resources, framing techniques or technologies or aids, and metaphors then are very important framing devices that are used in courts. And so this project is about the use of metaphor as strategic resources. And Ken and I went around and around and around a bit about my use of the term strategic. I mean, Ken certainly recognizes me as a critical scholar, and I perhaps could have said the instrumental use, but I really do mean strategic use of the goal-directed and maybe the power-reflecting kind of use of metaphor in order to shape and limit understanding in this regard. So I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of the parts of this project. Again, it is still developing, but I want to give you a sense of what we are planning and are doing with this project. So this project wants to enhance our understanding of socio-technical change. We want to explore the relationship between technology and markets and judicial decisions that both enable and constrain. Again, the guy that you saw up there talked about limiting, but power is also exercised by enabling some things rather than others. We want to look at both of those things that are part of this process. A central part of this discussion wants to look at the role of information in the global economy. And so part of what we want to argue that there's a critical role for this policy system that is developing around the transformation part of what we hinted at dinner last night, the commodification of information. So if we understand the development of global economies as being focused to a large part on the ways in which we turn information, the ways in which we turn communication and stimulation through speech and other technologies into a commodity, a product, something that can be sold, are the special qualities of that product that require innovation in law because of the nature of the product. And we want to be able to talk to people about the nature of the ways in which privatization of cyberspace raises particular kinds of problems in order to deal with this thing called an information good. Part of what we also want to understand is the ways in which courts are different from legislatures. Again, you think about those actors that are involved in creating the law, And the spheres then within the legal system or the policy system that shape the law, and what are the nature of the actors that are involved in influencing laws made in the legislature, and compare that to the actors that are involved in the resources that are brought to bear in the creation and interpretation of the law in the courts. They're quite different. We might argue that there is some similarity in terms of the use of language and the idea of information subsidies, that we try to shape the law in the legislature by giving testimony, by making speeches, by offering documents, by going through the press. We want to think maybe that the court is somewhat different in that there's not direct cash transfers in the courts. There might be that as well, but I haven't studied that is the same way I've studied speech. But we do know that rhetoric, we do know that information subsidies play a role in the courts. And we have access to direct subsidies. That is the kinds of documents, the kind of petitions, the kinds of briefs, the kind of oral testimony that's given in the courts. And fortunately, those resources, those information subsidies are available to us as analysts to understand how it is that actors use those resources, including images and words and examples, as a powerful resource in order to shape the way in which the law responds to a problem on the agenda. There's a literature that's developing with regard to the nature of briefs and the extent to which briefs have an influence on the courts. Some of what this literature is suggesting that briefs play an informational role, so that one might expect that the judges, in the same way that members of Congress are said to value lobbyists because lobbyists provide them with information. And part of the challenge for you and for us, but certainly for you as well if you want to pursue this path that I'm suggesting, is to understand what's the nature of the influence, what's the nature of the economic exchange within the court. What are the people who are offering briefs, especially amicus briefs? There's been a tremendous increase in the number of briefs being offered by friends of the court. Well, why do they do this is the question that you should be asking. Who does it? When do they do it? Why do they do it? What kinds of resources are brought to bear when they are making this contribution of information? And the literature is suggesting that they are making an informational contribution. And you might have thought, at least I thought, that the information that was being offered was novel. So you'd say, well, these bright men and women up there are really going to value something that they hadn't thought about. The literature seems to suggest that the influence is not quite that way. They really are paying attention to information that is, in fact, repeating and consistent with the brief of the party you're writing in support in. And apparently the justices, and this is kind of my aside to the political nature of the court, they are interested in information about what the consequences are of the decisions that might be rendered. What does this matter? What are the long-term consequences? We might decide whether they mean consequences for people who matter or for themselves, but nevertheless, they're concerned about what the implications are of a decision that's going to be granted. And as you begin to make your way through these briefs, you see evidence about references to what the consequences are, what the impact, what this means beyond this decision you're making with regard to Joseph Blow, what this means for the rest of folks. All right, so to give you an idea of some of the kinds of issues that we are exploring, and then I want to try to say, to give you access to some examples of some of the language, the discourse, the metaphors that we're finding in these studies. So amongst the issues that we're exploring, one of them that's truly interesting is jurisdiction and locale. All right, so what's the nature of authority that comes to bear with regard to cyberspace? A crime occurs in cyberspace. Well, everybody knows where is cyberspace. Cyberspace is no geophysical place. So if a crime occurs in cyberspace, which police, which courts, which judges, which agencies of control are going to enforce, are going to have the right to make a decision, are going to enforce a decision, and indeed, where are you going to put it? You're going to put you in a jail in cyberspace? That's cool, right? Rather than one here. That's kind of a question. So policy workers dealing in the privacy area talk about, to use a metaphor finally, a patchwork quilt. Describes the kind of law in different jurisdictions within the United States and different jurisdictions globally in terms of what kind of rules are established in terms of what kind of personal information can be collected and how it can be used. Trying to understand, how you say whether or not, an expectation about California, which has got a reasonable privacy protection in comparison with New Jersey, in terms of what kinds of things you're allowed to do. Well, trying to understand whether or not a French court should have any jurisdiction over an American company established in Delaware operating in California about whether or not it ought to be able to have an auction site that's selling Nazi propaganda. He says, Yahoo, over here in this regard. Well, it's a question of, should a French court have any kind of jurisdiction, all right, over an American country just because they happen to have laws about racism and incitement to violence and the like, and we don't over here in that regard, is part of this question about who should have jurisdiction. Of course, some of you might be familiar with this idea that cyberspace is a place all of its own. It ought to have laws of its own, and courts of its own, and police of its own, and punishment of its own. And some of you who have studied sort of the development of cyberspace have seen, examples of where Mr. Lost the name of this character who does a rape in cyberspace. Anybody, Mr. Dibble, yes, but it's a name for the bad actor. In any event, the idea that a person could be killed, eliminated, destroyed in cyberspace as long as you can keep them from not coming back in that space. Well, we want to figure out, whether or not cyberspace then should have its own laws, should be like the wild, wild west in that regard, and that the law comes out at the end of a gun. The fact that a gun in cyberspace is enabled by code, may or may not matter in this regard. What's the nature of power? What's the nature of jurisdiction? Who's going to have the authority is probably what you want to study. It also matters what's the nature of the crime in cyberspace and how we identify, the nature of the act. Most of the concern that we're going to explore is about the nature of property. And therefore, what's the nature of the crimes against property that are going to occur in cyberspace? How do you identify them, and how do you pursue those interests? So part of the problem here is that the kinds of crime that matters, the property that matters in cyberspace is information. Right? So we understand, or perhaps should understand, cyberspace as a set of communicative interactions that are enabled by computers, but that which moves, if it moves, right, is information in that regard. And the characteristic of information is that it is intangible, is that it is immaterial. While there might be books, while there might be films, while there might be, those tokens are not the information. Those are the carriers. Those are the things that make it possible to store. Those are the things that make it possible to transport. Those are the things that make it possible to share. But they are not the information. So in order to somehow make information a thing, a property, something that can be treated like property, and one of the major features of property is that you can exclude somebody else from having access to it. What's the nature of the kind of law that you have to develop in that you are able to exclude others from and punish people who would have unauthorized access to this intangible, immaterial kind of property that we're talking about. So that's one of the features. Economists, hide your head now in the room. All right, economists might talk about the characteristics of information. They talk about it as having at least two features that really matter here. One of the features is that consumption is non-rival, non-rivalrous consumption. That is, person over here can consume the information and it's still available. Indeed, an unmeasured number of folk can consume information and it's still available. Indeed, we might even argue that we're better off if a lot of people consume the information, in that if you have a sense of it, it's being reproduced. And therefore, there's more information at one level, more copies of it anyway than there was before. The other is the problem of non-excludability. It's very difficult and perhaps impossible to keep people from getting access to information, keep people from sharing this information. Information doesn't want to stay bound in this regard. Makes it really hard then to have a commodity, right, if you can't keep people from getting access to it without paying in this regard. Well, if these are the characteristics of information, how do you have a crime of theft? With material property, if you take it, you don't have it anymore. With an immaterial property, if you take it and they still have it, what have you taken? So how can that be a crime? That you take something from somebody and they still have it. We have to struggle in order to create a crime of theft with regard to information. So what you find is that the legislatures create and the courts support the existence of a whole new class of crimes in order to establish and rationalize a market for this immaterial information good, which is understood to be at the core of this global economy. So part of the challenge before the court is to determine the nature of the harm or the loss or the injury that's likely to be caused by activities in cyberspace. Part of the problem is to talk about, okay, so what's the nature of these spaces, where people have access to information at near zero marginal cost. So one of the ways in which we're dealing with the problem of theft is to say, well, maybe we can talk about getting access to the information in the first place. So maybe this wants to be the crime of trespass. But if cyberspace is not a real space and you can't, it's an immaterial space, where's trespass? Well, maybe trespass is to the server. And you're accessing the server where this information is stored in that regard. And so you'll find cases which have trespass to a server. Well, you want to understand what's the nature of the crime then, and what's the nature of the harm when you have trespass or unauthorized access to a server, and should it matter if the motivation of the actor is not criminal? So I want to ask here, and I'm looking at a buddy of mine, should a denial of service attack, all right, that brings down a corporate server be excused because the motivation of the hacktivists was the defense of human rights? Right, it's a good thing, and therefore it should be excused in this regard. But what if the hacker were merely seeking to demonstrate that the security systems that come packaged with your monopoly software is flawed? And so they're also doing a public service by demonstrating, don't install that. So what, should that can't be trespass if it's for a good purpose in that regard. So that's one of the things that we're exploring here, how it is that you're characterizing the act, how it is that you're characterizing the motivation behind the act in order to place this act in a particular setting where the orientation of the court looks one way rather than another way on the act. There are other kinds of issues as well. They had to do with core values like freedom of speech and access to information. These are values then that come into conflict. So it's about values in conflict. What's the nature of, I hate this word here, balance here between these values in order to make or to render a decision. In all these, we also observe the court struggling in order to maintain some kind of balance between these values, between the interest of actors and the, if you will, the motivation, the rationale, the support for investment in the development of these new technologies and the markets and the employment, and the improved quality of life that flows from the development of cyberspace and the business that takes place there. Okay, so the role of metaphors in all of this. I suggested that the approach we're taking to understand the role of the court is on the strategic use of metaphors. We understand metaphors as being a vitally important cognitive resource. Metaphors enable us to understand things that are unfamiliar in terms of their relationship to things that are more familiar to us. Okay, that's what it's like, so we need to have this resource. So metaphors then are a beneficial resource. We couldn't communicate, we couldn't learn, we couldn't decide, we certainly couldn't teach if we didn't have metaphors available to us. In the same way, however, that metaphors shape and enable and improve and could enhance our understanding, metaphors could also distort. Metaphors could also produce bias, misunderstanding of the world. And there's a special character of metaphors within courts in that they have a certain kind of permanence, in the same way that roads have a permanence in terms of you want to go this direction rather than some other direction in that regard. So legal scholars are helping Ken and I understand the role of metaphors within the legal system, within legal discourse, and what the role plays here. They've examined the role of metaphor in legal decision making. We understand the marketplace of ideas metaphor. So here's one that's got an incredible history and an incredible power. This is a metaphor that has resisted critical challenge that says, but wait a minute, we understand that the market doesn't operate the way the marketplace of ideas suggests that it should, and to depend upon it and to use it within the courts is going to take us astray in this regard. Phil Napoli suggests that this metaphor has been used within FCC documents both to support regulation and to support deregulation. But part of what Ken and I have to explore is the way metaphors and the use of metaphors change over time. And I really don't have time for an aside, but nevertheless, Ken would like, he'll allow me to say this, he would like to say, here's this metaphor and it's going to be identified with an actor, over a period of time and in a position over time. But no, there's a struggle, right? So metaphors are captured. Where's Deborah, right? So, metaphors, we want to understand in terms of the way others will capture it and turn it to their own uses in this regard. In the same way that the marketplace of ideas, which once had a good value for talking about democracy, was captured and was transformed to use in order to defend economic interest in this regard. So you can see this change within the commission in this regard. We want, therefore, to understand the strategic use of metaphors. We want to understand the battle or the struggle in order to, if you will, to rehabilitate a metaphor in order to use it in the interest of other forces as part of our project as well. Part of the challenge is to understand why particular actors use particular kinds of metaphors. And again, it's related to this motivation thing. We can understand why petitioners on either side would want to use it strategically in order to, in order to get the bad guys off or in order to protect the good guys in this regard. But why do judges, why do justices also use metaphor? What's the nature of their interest? What's the value that they are seeking to preserve in this regard? Well, the cynic, the critical scholar that I am, wants us also to understand judges and justices as political actors. We want to understand them as having ideological goals. So they want to use it in order to win battles that they are committed to both publicly and privately. So part of our challenge is to also understand the ideological use of metaphors. This, of course, involves, our ability to identify to identify the ideological character of an actor and see if we can associate the use of metaphors for an ideological purpose in the kinds of decisions. You might expect it within dissents. The question is whether or not and how we can figure out what's the nature of this use within a majority, because it may not be so clear whether or not there is a readily identifiable ideological character of the decisions that are voted on by the majority. But again, that's part of the pass that we want to do here. Part of the problem we're going to face is, as I suggested, that metaphors are not stable. They change over time, and this is even more of a problem with regard to the internet in that it's a technology-driven reality, and therefore the technology is changing, the services are changing, the markets are changing, and therefore the metaphors that apply have to change rapidly. So part of our exploration is looking, and I'm racing, is looking at the change of metaphors over time in the court. So you can say, well, yeah, so there was this thing of the information superhighway. That metaphor was around for a while. It was very popular, but we want to understand what's the political, what's the ideological basis for the use of the internet superhighway and why it was replaced by cyberspace, and what are the entailments, to use Ken's term again here, of the use of a different metaphor in this regard. Well, certainly as Larry is nodding over here, the information superhighway is related to roads, which are related to government financed and regulated infrastructure on one hand, whereas this cyberspace wants to be wild and free and therefore not subject to government regulation in this regard, but it's also reflecting what we understood the nature of cyberspace to be. So that's two parts of this change that we're exploring. There's a third one that we were very intrigued by, Oren Kerr, K-E-R-R, you're supposed to write that down. has also contributed to the literature with regard to two perspectives in the law, what he calls an internal and an external perspective. An internal perspective is the one from the perspective of the user. So you are a surfer and you are moving around and you are in a chat group and you are in, so that's what your actual experience feels like to you. Or especially if you've got a VR hood and you're off somewhere in a virtual space engaging with your avatar, with whatever else is going on in that space. Your experience, what you feel, what you believe, what you paid your temporary dime for is the perspective. That's very different from the external, all right, or the third-party view, the view of the engineers. Yeah, but what's really going on here? Not what you felt or what you intended, but what's the nature of the engineering or the technology here? So quoting from Kerr, he says, well, when you surf the web, visiting Amazon.com resembles calling information and asking for Amazon.com's phone number and then dialing the number and asking the representative to send you the latest Amazon.com catalog. That's very different from surfing the web. You know, a set of engineers would describe that in more distanced text, you know, about what is actually occurring when you visit Amazon.com. All right, so here are two constructions of what goes on when an activity, when an act, right, takes place in cyberspace. And so one of our questions is, well, is it internal or external at the language that's used, or a metaphor that does what? That brings the court to think about it from this perspective rather than that perspective. So in one of the cases that we started to study, and the reason I'm looking at my clock, and I'm going to apologize, is that we didn't plan very well, and so we've got to be on an early flight, so we've got to dash out of here and get to our car and get to the airport in a short period of time. So you're going to have to communicate with me via email in order to pursue some of these issues, or somebody's got to find the money and bring me back when I can come and stay for a longer time. So this early case about U.S. versus Thomas was primarily about jurisdiction and the site of the crime, but it raised some interesting questions about what does it mean in order to transmit sexually explicit content across state lines. So an internal perspective matters if you want to charge a California couple with sending pictures of sex to a federal postal agent in Tennessee. It matters what you thought you were sending in this regard. So did Thomas send obscene pictures? Or did Thomas's computer send a set of instructions that the inspector's computer might or might not be able to follow and produce a good copy of the images that Thomas scanned into his computer? Of course, we understand that electronic funds transfer doesn't send the money. That would be neat, wouldn't it, right? But no, it sends a set of instructions. And I look at my wife over here and say, well, we also know you can't beam me up, Scotty, right? The notion of what these things really are and what's actually going on in this process here. This internal-external distinction played a central role in the court's deliberations in Universal City versus Ramirez. And this is a case that a court had to decide what was the best way to think about hyperlinks. So again, an internal construction would have hyperlinks magically transporting the seeker to a site where they would be provided with the software that they could use to commit this newly minted crime of circumvention. You're supposed to laugh when I say that. I'm sorry. Okay, that was a joke. All right.
I don't know what circumvention is.
So circumvention is about your use of a technology in order to provide you with access to decrypt, all right, the software that enables, you know, this thing to play on your screen, but only play on your screen if you paid or not. All right, you would circumvent this technology. So now it's against the law, and it's against the law, seriously, criminally against the law, for you to circumvent new crime in order to turn access to information into a crime that is seriously punishable in this regard. Create a new crime, new technology, new event, but a new way of talking about this within the courts. So part of the argument in the courts is about the functionality. It's about this technology doing something. What we wanted to understand, though, is whether or not the technology did something or whether or not it really was the user. Was the journalist? Was it the publisher? Was it the web provider that was guilty, if anybody was guilty at all? Or was it really the user? Because the user had to act. The functionality only existed when they did something, where they followed a link. Now, we'll say a little bit more about that if I have 2 or 3 minutes left, which I really suspect I will not. And again, I apologize for that, and I'm getting you ready to invite me back again if you want some more of this discussion. But really what I want you to understand, if cyberspace is a place, and if cyberspace is a place where it's a place of commerce, and certainly and increasingly it is a place of commerce, well, shouldn't the public accommodation laws apply in cyberspace as well as they do in meat space? Well, that's certainly what a group of representatives of the visually impaired said, that in the case of, lost their name, Access Now versus Southwest Airlines. They say that they were denied, they were discriminated against because they couldn't get full and equal access to the websites at Southwest, I think it's Southwest Airlines. The courts said that, well, we've read the legislature, we've read the statute, and the statute said these 12 things are places. And they intended that these 12 places to be physical material places, not virtual places. And they decided that this case, therefore, does not apply. But the understanding that I want us to have is that they did not do it because they felt at this point in time, the development of cyberspace and the internet, that would be too much of a burden, all right, on the providers of all of these virtual services. I mean, again, understand this in terms of all of the, e-government, right, in terms of all of the access points where you're supposed to enter and engage in, certainly much more efficiently, do the business of government without going to the office and standing in line and dealing with people who have headaches on that day. So you certainly do want to provide equal access. You certainly don't want to discriminate against people who want to have access to government services or commercial services, but that's what this debate is really about. Again, the lesson is that the kinds of decisions, the kinds of metaphors, the kind of internal versus external orientations that are used shape and have consequences for people's access to resources. I can't do all of this. I wanted to talk to you all about a series of cases that we've organized, those having to do with protecting young people from access to sexual content. So cases having to do with Reno versus the ACLU, the US versus the American Library Association, Ashcroft versus the ALA, Ashcroft versus Ashcroft, yes, versus ACLU, thank you. The ALA case is really kind of interesting in terms of deciding what's a public space and whether or not librarians that were introducing internet access were providing a public forum, because a public forum is a public space in which there ought to be no or nearly no limitations on free speech. And so if the libraries were providing this, they couldn't also be required to put filters and to limit the kind of access. And I would be uncouth if I didn't at least read a couple of these. So, part of what they wanted to argue was that filtering was the equivalent of making an acquisition decision. And so Justice Souter says, at every single point, however, the internet blocking here defies comparison to the process of acquisition. The proper analogy, therefore, is not passing up a book that might have been bought. It's either buying a book and then keeping it from adults lacking an acceptable purpose, or buying an encyclopedia and then cutting out pages with anything thought to be unsuitable for all adults. And they borrowed this directly, I think, from the brief from the Association of American Publishers. And quoting from that, "This is no way analogous to a decision by librarians to acquire a book on Mark Twain rather than one on rap music, for example. It's instead analogous to scissoring by a government contractor of important articles from a magazine to which the library subscribes and to which library patrons expect full access." In fairness, the last example that I will give you, if I can find it, yes, is NCTA versus Brand X. And this is really about the nature of service, and the nature of services that are provided. Justice Scalia is a real gas, and it's really good to read his opinions. It's really good to read his opinions. It's really good to read his questions in oral argument as he's trying to pin somebody down. I mean, in terms of what they really mean by this. Do you really mean? Give me a yes or no answer in this regard. In this particular case, Scalia is introducing pizza delivery, because it's really about what's the nature of the service delivery by an ISP versus, by a cable ISP versus a telecom ISP. What's the nature of the service in this regard? So, quoting the brief from the ACLU, if the cable pipeline is a road and the ISPs are the companies that own the trucks that drive in the road, then internet communications are the packages that users send in the trucks. If there's only one trucking company to choose from, and those trucks refuse to carry a particular package of communication, then those senders, internet speakers, have no speech alternatives. They cannot protect their interest by switching providers. All right? So a metaphor, an extended metaphor that says, here's the nature of this environment. Scalia wanted to talk about distinctions about complex services having to do with pizza delivery. And here's Scalia's dissent. If I, for example, call up a pizzeria and ask whether they offer delivery, both common sense and common usage would prevent them from answering, nah, we don't offer delivery, but if you offer a pizza from us, we'll bake it for you and then bring it to your house. He wasn't finished. He went on. Our pizza man might continue to deny the obvious and explain, paraphrasing the FCC in the court, no, even though we bring pizza to your house, we're not actually offering you delivery, because the delivery that we provide to our end users is part and parcel of our pizzeria pizza at home service, and it's integral to other capabilities. Now, while Scalia may have had the last laugh that you joined in with his clever critique, the majority had the last word, and it's the last word that matters for a while here. And so the majority said, poking their fingers at Scalia, a customer could actually pick up the pizza rather than having it delivered. They also suggested that a person who purchases a connection to the internet cannot get it without the information processing that comes along with it. True. More critically, the majority challenged the underlying rationale for using the transportation metaphor in the first place. Quoting, we doubt that a statute, for example, subjected offers of delivery service such as the Federal Express and United Parcel Service to common carrier regulation would unambiguously require pizza delivery companies to offer their services on a common carrier basis. Right? Notion of it's ridiculous to think that pizza ought to be common carrier. And at that point, I'll stop and give you 5 minutes to ask questions. Thank you. Yes.
Most of the metaphors you describe are different ways to conceptualize space. You think of the freeways, you think of the boundaries, the borders, the services, and transportation. But there's one underlying metaphor, which is that it's a space. And I'm wondering to what extent you're questioning that one, or if you're going into other metaphors that are not spatial.
There is good question, Francois. There are there's a community of lawyers, legal scholars, that are exploring, yes, just what's the nature of this space. I don't think, though, that the interests are yet ready to deny that it's spatial. So, for example, the cases that I jumped over that talked about protecting children from access to this dangerous content, they would say, well, it's spatial because there are zones, and you can characterize these zones, and notion of zoning is spatial. The idea that you can have a wall, that you can have a turnstile, again, spatial, that there's a place that you can get to. There's a way that you can bar people from getting into that space, and that you can hold them in this space and force them to provide a token of identification. So the spatial, locational metaphors are not yet going away, because it matters for interests to be able to say, for the purpose of the argument, but more critically, and again, I didn't do this, for the purpose of the doctrine that talks about spaces, and spaces to exclude people from spaces. And so part of this literature, which is really struggling with the ways in which we were really smart to use this metaphor, but have now been hoisted on our own petard, have been kind of caught, by this metaphor because we didn't mean for it to have those entailments in this regard. Whether or not they engaged in the kind of discussion we'd have over coffee or something, about what is space, they perhaps don't, but legal scholars do. All right, so Julie Cohen has written, and you can go to her website and see her pre-publication version of her discussion about this spatial metaphor in particular in that regard. One more quick one.
I thought of this originally when we were talking about the difference between the legislative and the judicial branch in terms of metaphors, and this came up at the end also. It seems in the legislative branch you can sort of throw metaphors around, and the extent to which they're believed or not believed, there's no sort of interrogation. I mean, no one ever says, there's no reason that you have to go back and say, is this really right? Whereas it seems the unique thing about the judicial branch is this sort of Scalia thing that you're talking about, let's pick it apart. Have you found that there's a difference between how metaphors sort of play, given that they're exposed to interrogation as opposed to media? Or
That's very good. No, I haven't really, I'm not sure that I want to agree entirely, all right, with you about the extent to which one can differentiate between those in terms of whether or not there's interrogation, because I believe that there's interrogation in both of those spheres. But part of a challenge I invite you to help us think with is the degree to which there is the nature of friction in the court, in terms of the degree to which what you said last year and what you've said 30 years ago, kind of constrains your ability to shift horses, he says metaphorically, is problematic in the courts. And that's part of what we want to explore in terms of the extent to which the judges and justices are identified with their metaphors and their use of metaphors in the same way that you're identified with your publications. All right, you want people to read them, you want people to cite them, you want people to be guided by them in that regard. So, yes, I got to go, okay? It was a